"Mom, did you enjoy the account Dad left you?" Daniel asked, his voice casual, almost distracted, as if he were asking about the weather. And I remember standing there in my small kitchen, my hand still resting on the edge of the counter, the coffee maker humming softly behind me. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him, because in 30 years of marriage, Edward had never left anything unexplained, never hidden anything from me. So I looked at my son and said, "What account?" And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, almost invisible way, like a floorboard loosening beneath your feet. And Daniel blinked, just once, before his eyes flickered briefly toward Rebecca, who was standing near the doorway, her arms crossed a little too tightly, her smile a little too still. And then he laughed, a short, uncertain sound. "The one Dad set up, you know, for you." And I didn't know? That was the problem. I didn't know anything about any account, not a savings account, not an investment, nothing. And yet my son was looking at me like I should, like I had simply forgotten, like it was a small oversight instead of something that didn't make sense at all. And I felt something settle deep in my chest, not panic, not even fear, just a quiet awareness that something wasn't right. And I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded slowly and said, "No, Daniel, I don't think I do." And for a second, the room felt too quiet, the kind of silence that stretches just long enough to reveal what people are trying to hide. And Rebecca stepped forward then, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Maybe it was just paperwork," she said, her tone light, but too quick. "You know how confusing those things can be." And I looked at her, really looked at her, the way her fingers tightened slightly around her sleeve, the way she avoided my eyes just a fraction of a second too long. And I realized she wasn't confused, she was careful, and that was different, very different. And I turned back to my son, who was now checking his phone like the conversation had already ended, like it didn't matter. And I said nothing more, because sometimes the moment you ask too many questions is the moment people start closing doors, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead I picked up my coffee mug, now lukewarm, and took a small sip, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue as I watched them move around my kitchen, my home, a place that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And I thought about the past 2 years, about the way I had been living since Edward passed, counting every dollar, choosing between groceries and medication some months, telling myself it was normal, that things were tighter without him, that this was just what aging looked like, quieter, smaller, more careful. And yet Daniel and Rebecca had just come back from another trip, Florida this time, beachfront hotel, ocean views, photos I had seen online, smiling faces, expensive dinners, and I had never questioned it. Not really, because I was proud of my son, because I believed he had built his life on hard work, just like his father had. But now, standing there with that single question echoing in my mind, I felt something begin to rearrange itself, small pieces shifting into place, details I had ignored before suddenly sharper, clearer. And I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to confront anyone, not yet, because whatever this was, whatever account Daniel thought I had, it existed somewhere, on paper, in records, in numbers that didn't lie. And I had spent 30 years beside a man who believed in planning, in protecting, in making sure I would be taken care of. And Edward was not the kind of man who forgot to tell his wife about something important, which meant if there was an account, it had been hidden, and if it had been hidden, there was a reason. And as I set my cup down on the counter and watched Rebecca turn slightly away from me, I understood one thing with a clarity that surprised even me. I didn't need answers from them. Not yet, because the truth was already out there waiting, and this time, I was going to find it myself. I did not ask Daniel anything else that morning, and I did not mention the account again, not because I had forgotten, but because I had not. In fact, I could not stop thinking about it. The way his voice had sounded so certain, the way Rebecca had stepped in just a little too quickly. And I have learned something over the years. When people rush to explain something you did not even question yet, it usually means there is more beneath the surface. So I went on with my day as I always did, quietly, carefully, folding laundry that had already been folded once, wiping down a kitchen counter that was already clean, keeping my hands busy so my mind could work. And by late afternoon, I had made a decision that felt simple on the outside but carried weight I could feel in my chest. I was going to the bank the next morning, the same branch Edward and I had used for over 20 years, The same place where he used to handle everything while I waited in the car or sat beside him listening without really listening, trusting him completely. And that trust had never felt misplaced until now. The next morning I left early, before the traffic picked up, the sky still pale and quiet. And I drove the familiar route, every turn bringing back small memories. Edward pointing out a shortcut. Edward reminding me to bring paperwork. Edward always one step ahead. And when I parked outside the bank, I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, not shaking, just still, because I understood that whatever I found inside might change how I saw the past 30 years of my life. And then I stepped out of the car and walked in, the air inside cool and predictable, the faint scent of paper and carpet cleaner the same as it had always been. And when I approached the front desk, the young woman greeted me with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and I gave her my name, Margaret Collins, and I told her I needed to review all accounts associated with my late husband, Edward Collins, and myself. And she nodded, typing quickly, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced ease, and for a few seconds, nothing happened. Just the quiet clicking of keys, the low hum of the building, and then her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight pause, a subtle change that most people might not have noticed, but I did, because I was paying attention now, fully, carefully, and she looked up at me and said, "Ma'am, I see your joint checking account and savings account, but there are also additional accounts listed here." And I felt that same quiet awareness settle deeper, not surprise, not yet, just confirmation that I had been right to come, and I asked her to show me everything, every account, every record, no matter how small, and she hesitated just briefly before nodding again, printing documents, organizing them into a neat stack. And as she handed them to me, I noticed the numbers before I even read. The details, balances that did not match the life I had been living, amounts that could have covered every bill I had worried about, every prescription I had delayed, every small sacrifice I had quietly accepted as necessary. And I sat down at a small desk nearby, the papers spread out in front of me, and I began to read slowly, carefully, line by line, not rushing, because this was not something to rush through. And what I saw did not make sense at first. Accounts opened years ago, some in Edward's name, some linked in ways I did not fully understand yet, and transfers, regular transfers, small enough to go unnoticed over time, but consistent, deliberate. And I realized then that this was not an accident. This was a system, something planned, something maintained over years, and I leaned back slightly in the chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, and I thought about Daniel's question again, about Rebecca's quick explanation, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had not wanted to see before, that whatever Edward had set up, whatever he had prepared, it had not reached me, and that meant someone had stepped in between, quietly, deliberately. And as I gathered the papers back into a single stack, my movements calm and precise, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not confusion. This was not a mistake. And whatever had been hidden from me was only the beginning of something much larger. I did not go straight home after leaving the bank. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off, the papers resting neatly in my lap, the late morning sun filtering through the windshield. And for a long moment, I did nothing but look at the numbers again. The balances, the dates, the steady pattern of transfers. That stretched back years, and I realized something I should have noticed sooner. The amounts were not random. They followed a rhythm, small withdrawals spaced out just enough to avoid attention, just enough to seem ordinary if no one was watching closely. And I had not been watching, not because I could not, but because I trusted the people around me, and that trust had made me blind in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I traced one line with my finger, a transfer made just 3 months before Edward passed, then another one 2 weeks later, and then I saw it. A change, subtle but clear, the destination account shifted, the routing number different, the pattern continuing but leading somewhere new, and I leaned back in my seat, exhaling slowly as the pieces began to align, because changes like that do not happen on their own. Someone had made that decision. Someone had taken control of something that was never meant to be theirs, and I folded the papers carefully, placing them back into my purse with the same calm precision I had used all morning, because panic would not help me, and neither would anger. What I needed now was clarity, and that required patience, When I finally drove home, the house greeted me with the same quiet it always had. The ticking clock in the hallway, the faint creak of the floorboards as I walked in, everything exactly where it should be, and yet nothing felt the same. I set my purse down on the kitchen table and stood there. For a moment, looking at the space where Daniel had stood the day before, where Rebecca had leaned against the doorway, her voice light, but her eyes guarded, and I replayed the conversation in my mind. Every word, every pause, the way Daniel had assumed I knew, the way Rebecca had redirected, and I saw it more clearly now. They were not discovering something with me. They were reacting to something they thought I already understood, and when I did not, they adjusted, quickly, carefully, and that kind of adjustment only comes from experience, from practice, from having managed the same situation before. I moved slowly through the kitchen, filling a glass with water, taking a small sip, letting the coolness settle as I thought, and then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I opened the drawer where Edward used to keep his documents, the old files still organized in his precise way, labeled, dated, everything in its place, and I began to go through them one by one, not rushing, just reading, comparing, matching dates to the statements I had seen earlier, and it did not take long to find what I was looking for, a letter from the bank dated 5 years ago, confirming the creation of a separate account structure, one that required updates to beneficiary information to remain current, and I read that line twice, slowly, because it explained more than it seemed to at first. Updates do not happen without authorization, and authorization requires access, and access is not given lightly, especially not by Edward, who believed in control, in structure, in making sure everything was exactly as it should be, which meant if someone had updated anything, they had done so deliberately, with intention, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back exactly where I found it, my movements steady, my breathing even, because by then I was certain of one thing. This was not something that had happened recently. This had been unfolding quietly over time, step by step, change by change, and the people closest to me had been standing right in the middle of it. And as I stood there in the stillness of my kitchen, I felt no urge to confront them, no need to demand explanations, because whatever answers they might give me would only be part of the truth, and I was no longer interested in fragments. I wanted the whole picture, every detail, every decision, every moment where something had shifted without my knowledge, and I knew exactly how I was going to get it, not by asking, not by arguing, but by continuing exactly as I had started, quietly, carefully, and without letting them see how much I already understood. That evening I did not call Daniel, and I did not return any of his messages, not because I was upset, but because I had already stepped into something that required distance, and distance is not created through silence alone. It is created through control, through choosing what to say and when to say it, and I was not ready to say anything yet. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner, the same kind I had been making for months, a small portion, nothing extravagant, and I sat at the table where Edward and I used to sit together, the chair across from me still empty in the same quiet way it had been since the day he passed, and I found myself thinking about him, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one. The way he used to handle things, the way he approached problems, calm, methodical, never reacting too quickly. He used to say that the truth reveals itself to those who are patient enough to wait for it. And I had not fully understood what he meant back then, but now I did, because what I had seen at the bank was only part of the story, and the rest was still hidden somewhere in the details, in the decisions that had been made without me. And after dinner I cleared the table slowly, rinsing each dish, placing it in the rack with care, not because it needed to be done that carefully, but because it gave me time to think, and when everything was in its place, I walked into the living room and sat down in Edward's old chair, the one he always preferred, the leather worn just enough to feel familiar, and I allowed myself to go back, not just to the last few years, but further, to the years when things had still made sense, when Daniel would visit more often, when he would sit at this very table and talk about his work, his plans, his future. And I remembered when Rebecca first came into our lives, how polite she had been, how attentive, how she listened carefully, always asking questions, always observing. And at the time I had thought it was kindness, interest, a desire to belong. But now, looking back, I could see something else woven into those moments, something quieter, more deliberate, The way she paid attention to details that most people would overlook, the way she remembered small things, the kind of information that becomes useful later, and I realized that nothing had changed suddenly. There had been no single moment where everything shifted. It had been gradual, almost invisible, the kind of change that happens over time until one day you look up and realize the landscape is completely different. And I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, thinking about the documents I had found, the account structure, the updates that required authorization, and I asked myself a simple question: who had access? And the answer was not as complicated as it might have seemed. Edward had handled everything. But in the last few years, especially toward the end, there had been moments when he was tired, when he relied on others for small tasks. And I remembered Rebecca offering to help, just small things at first, picking up paperwork, dropping off documents, sitting with him during appointments when Daniel was busy. And at the time it had seemed thoughtful, supportive, the kind of help any family member would offer. But now those memories felt different, not wrong, but incomplete, as if I had only seen one side of them. And I stood up slowly, walking over to the bookshelf where Edward kept his old address book, flipping through the pages until I found the name I was looking for. A man named Harold Bennett, Edward's accountant for over 15 years, someone who knew the structure of our finances better than anyone else, someone Edward trusted without hesitation. And I traced the phone number with my finger, considering it carefully, because calling him would mean moving forward, stepping beyond observation into action. And I was not someone who acted without thinking. But I also knew that waiting too long could mean missing something important. And I closed the book gently, placing it back on the shelf, my decision forming. Not out of urgency, but out of clarity. I would call him in the morning, not to accuse, not to confront, but to understand, because understanding comes first, always. And as I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the quiet darkness of the room, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not fear, but a steady, grounded certainty that whatever had been hidden from me for all this time, I was now closer than ever to seeing it clearly, and this time, I would not look away. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, and by the time the sun came through the kitchen window, I was already dressed, already standing by the counter with the phone in my hand, looking at the number. I had not dialed in years, Harold Bennett, and I remember thinking how strange it felt that someone who had once been such a regular part of our lives had become a distant name in an old address book. And yet now he might be the only person who could help me understand what had been done, and I did not hesitate any longer. I pressed the call button and listened as it rang, once, twice, and then his voice came through, older, slower, but still steady. "This is Harold," and I introduced myself, Margaret Collins, and there was a brief pause before his tone shifted, recognition settling in. "Margaret, I am so sorry about Edward," and I thanked him, keeping my voice even, not letting the conversation drift into sympathy, because that was not why I had called, and I told him I needed to ask a few questions about our accounts, specifically any structures Edward may have set up in the years before he passed. And there was another pause, longer this time, not uncertainty, but consideration, as if he was choosing his words carefully, and then he said, "I was wondering when you might call," and that was enough to confirm what I already suspected, that there was more to this than a simple misunderstanding. And I asked him if he could meet in person, somewhere quiet, somewhere private, and he agreed without hesitation, suggesting a small office he still used downtown. And within the hour I was on my way, the drive feeling shorter this time, more focused, because now I was not searching blindly. I was following a path. When I arrived, Harold was already waiting, standing by the door, his posture straight despite his age, his expression calm but serious, and he led me inside, closing the door behind us before gesturing for me to sit. And I placed my purse on the desk, taking out the documents I had gathered, laying them out between us. And for a moment neither of us spoke. He simply looked at the papers, scanning them quickly, his eyes moving with the familiarity of someone who had seen these patterns before. And then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and said, "Edward set these up to protect you." And I did not react. I did not interrupt. I simply listened, because that word mattered, protect. And Harold continued, explaining that Edward had grown concerned in his later years, not about me, but about how easily financial control could shift after his passing, how access could be changed, how information could be redirected, and he had created a system that ensured I would remain the primary beneficiary, with safeguards that required direct confirmation for any updates. And I asked him quietly, "Then how were those updates made?" And Harold looked at me carefully before answering. "They should not have been, not without you." And there it was, the confirmation I needed, not speculation, not suspicion, but fact. And I felt something settle deeper inside me, not shock, not even disappointment, just a clearer understanding of the situation I was now facing. And I asked him one more question: who had access to initiate those changes? And he did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a folder on his desk, pulling out a document, sliding it toward me, and I saw the authorization line, the signature, and beneath it, the name Rebecca Collins. And I looked at it for a long moment, not because I did not recognize it, but because I needed to see it exactly as it was, plain, undeniable. And when I finally looked up, Harold was watching me, not with pity, but with respect, as if he understood that I did not need comfort, I needed clarity, and I nodded once, folding the document carefully and placing it back with the others, my movements steady, controlled. Because by then there was nothing left to question. The system Edward had built had not failed. It had been altered, and it had been altered by someone who stood in my kitchen, who spoke to me with a careful smile, who believed I did not see what was happening. And as I gathered my things and stood to leave, I felt something shift completely inside me, not a reaction, but a decision, quiet, precise, and final. I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I already knew. Now I was going to decide what to do about it. I did not go home right away after leaving Harold's office. Instead, I drove slowly, taking streets I had not taken in years, not because I was lost, but because I needed time to think without interruption. And as the city passed quietly around me, I began to see the situation not as something emotional, but as something structured, something that could be addressed step by step. And by the time I pulled into a small parking lot near a quiet cafe, I had already made my next decision. I was not going to confront Daniel or Rebecca, not yet, because confrontation gives people time to prepare, to adjust their story, to close whatever doors are still open. And I had no intention of giving them that advantage. Instead, I needed to move first. Quietly, in ways they would not expect, I sat in my car for a moment, taking out the documents again, reviewing them not for the information I already understood, but for what they allowed me to do next. And I remembered what Harold had said about the safeguards Edward had built, that I was still the primary beneficiary, that control had only been redirected, not removed, which meant I still had authority. I just had not used it, and that changed everything. I folded the papers carefully and stepped out of the car, not to go into the cafe, but to make a call. Another number I had not used in years, a law office Edward had once trusted for a business matter. And when the receptionist answered, I asked for an appointment, nothing urgent, just a consultation, and my voice remained calm, steady, because urgency would only draw attention. And within a few minutes, I had secured a meeting for the following morning. And that was enough for now. When I finally returned home, everything looked exactly as it had the day before. The same quiet kitchen, the same neatly arranged furniture, the same sense of stillness. But I was not the same person who had left that morning. I moved through the house with a different awareness, noticing details I had ignored before. The unopened mail on the counter, the calendar on the wall with dates marked in Rebecca's handwriting from her last visit, the subtle way she had already begun to place herself into the rhythm of my home. And I saw it clearly now, not as intrusion, but as positioning. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not because anything was amusing, but because I finally understood the shape of what I was dealing with. Later that evening, Daniel called again, and this time I answered, keeping my tone light, natural, exactly as it had always been. And he asked if everything was all right, if I needed anything, and I told him I was fine, that I had spent the day resting, organizing a few things, nothing unusual. And I could hear the relief in his voice, the ease that came from believing nothing had changed. And Rebecca's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking something I could not fully hear. And I responded the same way I always had, calm, appreciative, giving them no reason to question anything, because the less they suspected, the more time I had. And after the call ended, I sat in the living room again, the same chair, the same quiet space. But this time my thoughts were not drifting. They were focused, deliberate. I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was preparing for what would happen next, and I understood that whatever Edward had left for me was still there, still within reach. It had simply been redirected, and redirection can be undone, carefully, legally, and without confrontation if handled correctly. And as I looked around the room, at the life I had built over decades, I felt no anger, no urgency, only a steady sense of control returning, piece by piece. Because for the first time since this began, I was not the one being moved around the board. I was the one deciding the next move, and I intended to make it count. The next morning I arrived at the law office 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I have always believed that being early gives you time to observe, and observation had already become my most useful habit. The building itself was quiet, understated, the kind of place that did not draw attention but handled serious matters behind closed doors, and when I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me politely, asking me to take a seat, and I did, placing my purse neatly on my lap, my posture straight, my breathing steady, because this was not a moment for emotion. This was a moment for clarity. When the attorney finally called my name, he introduced himself as Michael Turner, his manner professional but not distant, and as we sat across from each other, I placed the documents on his desk without explanation, allowing him to review them. First, because what mattered now was not what I thought, but what could be confirmed, and he read through them carefully, his expression unchanged, his eyes moving slowly from one page to the next, and after a few minutes, he leaned back slightly and said, "Mrs. Collins, you are still listed as the primary beneficiary on these accounts," and I nodded, because that aligned with what Harold had already explained, but then he continued. However, there have been recent modifications to access permissions, which is where the issue lies, and I listened without interrupting, because every word mattered. Every detail added another layer to the structure I was beginning to see clearly. He explained that while ownership had not legally transferred, operational control had been partially redirected through authorization updates that should have required my direct involvement, and I asked him one simple question: can that be reversed? And he did not hesitate. Yes, it can, but it must be done carefully and documented properly. And that word again, carefully, it appeared in every step of this process, as if everything depended not on force, but on precision, and I felt a quiet sense of alignment with that. Because I had no intention of acting recklessly, he outlined the steps, not in a rushed or complicated way, but in a clear sequence. First, formally reasserting my authority as the primary beneficiary. Second, placing temporary holds on any further modifications. And third, initiating a full review of all account activities tied to Edward's original structure. And as he spoke, I could see the path unfolding, not dramatic, not confrontational, but effective, and I asked him to proceed, not immediately, but in a way that would not trigger unnecessary attention, and he nodded, understanding exactly what I meant without needing further explanation. Because people in his profession recognize the value of timing, and when the meeting ended, I stood, gathering my documents, my movements as calm as they had been when I arrived. But inside, something had shifted into place completely. This was no longer a situation I was trying to understand. It was a situation I was now actively managing, and when I stepped back outside into the daylight, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if everything around me had come into sharper focus. I returned home shortly after, moving through the same familiar spaces, but now, each detail felt like part of a larger structure I was finally seeing in full. And later that afternoon, Daniel called again, his voice relaxed, asking if I would like to come over for dinner later that week. Rebecca in the background suggesting a day, a time, everything sounding perfectly normal, perfectly routine, and I accepted, my tone warm, unchanged, because there was no reason to refuse. Not when being present would give me more than distance ever could. And after I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, not thinking about what I would say, but about what I would observe, because conversations reveal less than behavior, and behavior, when left uninterrupted, tells you everything. And I understood that the next time I saw them, I would not be the same person they believed me to be. I would be someone who already knew enough to remain silent, someone who no longer needed explanations, only confirmation. And as I looked at the clock on the wall, counting the hours until the next step would begin, I felt that same steady certainty settle deeper than before. I was no longer following the situation. I was now setting its direction, and I intended to see it through without a single unnecessary word. The day of the dinner arrived quietly, without any sense of urgency, and I prepared for it the same way I would have before any ordinary family visit. Choosing a simple outfit, something comfortable, something familiar, because there was no need to signal that anything had changed, and when I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving, I did not see someone anxious or uncertain. I saw someone composed, someone who had already made her decisions, and that was enough. The drive to Daniel's house was smooth, the streets lined with the same houses I had passed countless times, each one carrying its own quiet story, and when I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for just a moment, not to gather courage, but to settle into stillness, because stillness had become my greatest advantage. And then I stepped out, walking up to the door, ringing the bell once, and when Rebecca opened it, her smile appeared instantly, warm, welcoming, practiced. "Margaret, you made it," she said, stepping aside to let me in, and I returned the smile with the same calm ease, nothing forced, nothing exaggerated, just enough to keep everything exactly as they expected it to be. Daniel greeted me from the kitchen, his tone light, his posture relaxed, as if nothing in the world had shifted, and I noticed that immediately, not what he said, but how he moved, how comfortable he seemed, and that told me more than any words could. Dinner was already set, the table arranged neatly, plates aligned, glasses filled, everything in its place, and as we sat down, the conversation began the way it always did, small, ordinary topics, the weather, work, a recent trip they had taken, Rebecca describing it in detail, her voice smooth, her expressions controlled, and I listened, nodding occasionally, offering small responses when necessary, not interrupting, not steering the conversation, just observing. And the more I watched, the more I saw. The way Rebecca glanced at Daniel before answering certain questions. The way Daniel avoided looking directly at me when finances or plans were mentioned. The subtle coordination between them that might have seemed natural to anyone else, but now stood out clearly, like a pattern repeating itself. And at one point, Rebecca mentioned something casually, a renovation they were considering, something modest, she said, just a small upgrade. And I noticed the word choice, modest, when I had already seen the numbers, already understood the scale of their spending, and I simply nodded, taking a small sip of water, letting the moment pass without comment. Because correction was not my goal, confirmation was, and as the evening continued, I allowed myself to ask one question, carefully placed. "That sounds like quite an investment. Are you planning to use savings or something else?" And Daniel hesitated, just briefly, before answering. "We have been managing things pretty well." Vague, non-committal, and Rebecca added quickly, "We have had some help with structuring things." Her tone light, but her eyes watching me closely for any reaction, and I gave her none, just a small, understanding nod, as if everything she said made perfect sense, and that was enough, because in that moment, I saw it clearly, not just what they had done, but how they believed it would remain unnoticed, how they relied on the assumption that I would not question, would not look deeper, would simply accept what was presented to me, and that assumption had been their foundation, their quiet advantage. And now it was gone, but they did not know that yet, and that was where my advantage lay. The rest of the evening passed without tension, without conflict, just a continuation of the same careful balance. And when it was time to leave, Daniel walked me to the door, asking if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, his voice filled with the same familiar concern, and I assured him that I was, that everything was fine, because in a way, it was. Everything was exactly where it needed to be for what would come next, and as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt no need to look back, no hesitation, just a steady awareness that the pieces were now fully aligned, not just in understanding, but in timing, because the process had already begun, quietly, legally, and without their knowledge, and soon, the changes they had made would begin to reverse, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the same careful, deliberate way they had been put in place, and this time, I would be the one, watching from the other side, silent, patient, and completely in control. The changes did not happen all at once, and that was exactly how they needed to unfold, quietly, without disruption, without warning, just as everything before had been done. And over the next few days, I moved through my routine as if nothing had shifted, waking up at the same time, making the same breakfast, taking the same walks through the neighborhood, and answering Daniel's occasional calls with the same calm tone he had come to expect. Because consistency builds trust, and trust keeps people from looking too closely, and behind that consistency, everything was already in motion. Michael had begun the process exactly as we discussed, first placing temporary holds on all further modifications, a small step on paper, but one that quietly stopped any additional changes from being made without my direct authorization. And then the formal reassertion of my role as primary beneficiary, documented, filed, and confirmed, not something that would be announced, but something that would be recognized the moment anyone attempted to access what they no longer controlled. And I did not need to be present for any of it. I did not need to explain or justify, because the system itself would respond, and I understood now that systems, when designed properly, do not argue, they simply enforce. And a few days later, the first sign appeared, not in my home, not in a conversation, but in a call Daniel made earlier than usual, his voice carrying a slight tension he tried to conceal. "Mom, have you noticed anything unusual with the accounts?" he asked, carefully, as if the question itself might reveal too much, and I paused just long enough to seem thoughtful, not suspicious. "No, should I have?" I replied, my tone steady, neutral, and there was a brief silence. On the other end, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words, before he answered, "It is probably nothing, just a technical issue," and I nodded, even though he could not see me. "These things happen," I said, allowing the explanation to settle without challenge, because challenge would only make him cautious, and caution would slow everything down, and that was not what I wanted. After the call ended, I placed the phone down gently, not reacting, not even allowing myself the satisfaction of confirmation, because this was not about winning a moment. It was about completing a process. And later that same afternoon, Rebecca called, something she rarely did on her own, her voice polite but tighter than usual, asking if I had recently updated any information at the bank, and I answered simply, "I have been reviewing a few things, yes, not a lie, not the full truth, just enough to maintain balance." And I could hear the shift in her breathing, the slight change in her tone as she adjusted, recalibrating in real time. And that was all I needed to hear, because it told me everything was working exactly as it should. The access they had relied on was no longer stable. The control they believed they held was beginning to slip, and they could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. And that evening, as I sat in the same chair, the same quiet room surrounding me, I allowed myself to look at the documents one last time, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to see how far things had come, from uncertainty to clarity, from observation to action, and I placed them back into the folder, closing it gently, because there was no need to revisit them again. The rest would unfold on its own now. And for the first time since this began, I felt something that had been absent for a long time. Not relief, not satisfaction, but stability, the kind that does not come from knowing everything, but from knowing enough. And as the clock ticked quietly on the wall, marking time the same way it always had, I understood that the roles had fully reversed. I was no longer the one being left out, the one being guided without awareness. Now I was the one holding the information, the one allowing events to play out exactly as needed, and I did not need to say a single word for any of it to matter.